Well, Joash Thomas, it is so great to have you on the Beyond Sunday podcast. Welcome to the show today. How you doing?
Doing great, David. This is an honor. I've been a huge fan of your work and the show for a long time. So fun to get to be here. Yeah.
Yeah, man, so looking forward to this. Your book, The Justice of Jesus, has just been so enlightening in so many ways. I'm excited to dive into this. It's funny, what I kind of love about your book is like the size of it. It is entirely accessible and readable because so many of the other books I read look like this. Just
Right.
massive history books, and sometimes you just need like a book that's not too long where you can really get through it quickly, read it again, digest the information. And I find this, Joash, to be this book really important for the church right now. So the book is The Justice of Jesus, Reimagining Your Church's Life Together to Pursue Liberation and Wholeness. So I want you to tell us, man, like, who is this book for? Who did you primarily have in mind as you were writing this?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. I think for me, the book is for very much for people still in the evangelical church in North America. So I'm in Canada, but I'm a US citizen. I've, been to church in the States too. And I know that there are so many people right now who are just asking questions about everything, right? And they see unhealthy versions of Christianity and they start to question their own faith. They start to feel gaslit a little bit. They start to feel like, man, am I in the minority here? And unfortunately, I think you have a lot of those folks walking away from the church and walking away from Jesus. And that breaks my heart as a church leader, as someone who's always loved the church, who's gone to experience the fullness of the global church and all our ecumenical beauty. It's like I tell some of my friends, you've only tasted vanilla. There's so many other flavors out there, right? And look, maybe French vanilla is your thing. I love French vanilla, by the way, but but just don't walk away from ice cream without first looking at the other options and asking questions, because there's so much beauty and diversity out there within the global church.
Joash, take us into your story a little bit. Sounds like you've done some work here in the United States, and I'm curious as to at what point did you feel, when did all of this sort of like come to a head for you where you were like, man, something is not right, and you decided like, I need to be an advocate for justice or to bring a message that's a little bit countercultural to what I'm seeing in the
Mm,
American church. Can you talk about that?
yeah. Yeah, absolutely, David. I mean, I think I write the story out of my own journey of transformation. So
Yeah.
I was born and raised in Mumbai, India, to a St. Thomas Indian Christian family. So my ancestors have been worshiping Jesus for 2,000 years. We received the gospel from the Apostle Thomas, brought it to my ancestors. And my mom led me to Jesus at 5. She was my Sunday school teacher. I grew up, fifth generation Pentecostal on my dad's side and Orthodox Anglican St. Thomas on my mom's side. So, my family then moved to the States when I was 18, and I went to Georgia State for my bachelor's. And I knew I wanted to work in international human rights, very much had a heart for justice as a global South evangelical Christian that was taught to me by the church in the global South in my childhood. And so I came to the States and then started running into Christians who would say things like, well, justice, that's Marxist, that's woke, that's not really Christian, right? And for a second, I was like, wait a second, do I have this figured wrong? Did the global South evangelical church teach me the wrong things about Jesus?
Mm.
And so I had to kind of go on that journey myself. I actually worked in Georgia Republican politics, was seen as a rising star. My university, I was, leading
Wow.
my college Republican chapter at Georgia State and worked for the former governor of Georgia as a speechwriter on his reelection campaign. And, worked for Marco Rubio when he ran for president, right? So worked at all levels of Georgia Republican politics. And when I was in the Republican political world, I felt like I was advocating for some of my marginalized neighbors, but not all of them, because party lines and loyalties kept me from going the other direction. And as a Christian, that's ultimately why I left the political world, because I felt like the empires of this earth try to tell us that you have to pick and choose between your marginalized neighbors. But as followers of Jesus, we're called to stand with all of our poor and oppressed and marginalized neighbors, regardless of which side of the political aisle they fall on, right? And so for me, I had to kind of go on that journey. So I left the Republican political consulting world in early 2017. 2016 was obviously a big wake up call for me. Just a slow election year in the US, not much going on, but it was quite transformative for me in a lot of things becoming clear and asking questions about why the church was so resistant to justice, especially justice for our political enemies, when they're people made in the image of God too.
Yeah.
And so that led me to the work of international human rights. I basically, quit my political consulting lobbying practice, took a 50% pay cut, moved to DC to work in international human rights. And that was almost 10 years ago. I haven't looked back since then. So I've, gotten to work all over the world with the church and doing the work of justice, and have seen signs of hope everywhere. Obviously, there's a lot to be discouraged by, but I keep most of the book hope oriented because I've had a front row seat in seeing God at work in unique ways in the justice space through the global church. And that's what I'm trying to inspire the Western church with through the book.
How do you talk to people, Joash? Because I've found myself very frustrated by some of these conversations I'm even having on my podcast, where anytime you sort of start talking about anything justice related, like you said, I mean, the very first sentence of your book is this social justice stuff isn't Christian, it's Marxist. And so there is sort of this immediate confrontation when you start talking about the justice of Jesus with we have to completely throw this out like it's not even Christian. And I feel a similar sense of that disillusionment that you're describing. How do you have these conversations with people that sort of react to this message in that way?
Yeah. I think it's important to, first reframe how we're seeing those we're engaging with, right? And I know you do such a good job at embodying this, David, but, I try not to see people as whatever political affiliation they identify with. I try to see them as a child of God, made in the image of God, the same God who we say in the Nicene Creed is light from true light, right? So when Jesus tells us that we are the light of the world, that means that there is light in us. There's goodness in us from the moment of our birth and creation. And of course, that light gets dimmed because of sin on this earth, including injustice. But the gospel is Jesus coming to point us to that light within us and to point us to the light of God so that we can walk with God in the light, right? And so I think for me, I told my bishops this during my own ordination as a deacon. And, I said, look, if I can be graceful to the Joash of 10 years ago, I can definitely be graceful to someone else today who is not where I am theologically or any way. So I think, I try to see the goodness in them, try to see where the image of God is, where the Spirit is at work in their lives. And I try to appeal to that. I try to speak to that. I try to engage and love. I also try to just be faithful and present. I think in the West, we're conditioned to have this mindset of success. But if you look at the life of Jesus, he was just faithful. He was okay with letting Nicodemus walk away untransformed, right? Trusting that, hey, I've just been faithful here and there's a larger plan and play here. So I think freeing ourselves of that expectation of success and being present and faithful and attentive and just being the loving presence of Christ, the healing balm of Christ where we are. Obviously, all of this is easier said than done, but, in many ways, I think it requires us being transcendent to our own traumas as we try to transcend the trauma and lived experience of the other person who's coming at us with very different views, right? And so, I've been trying to reframe this even in my teaching, where I've been saying more recently, what if instead of seeing people as heretics or blank or, my enemies, essentially, we just saw them as beautiful people made in the image of God on their own journey, who've also been shaped by their own traumas and life experiences. And I think that's the posture I try to embody. Yeah.
Yeah, when you study history, Joash, which I know you have, you realize that the work of justice is long, it's slow, and it's lonely. I mean, this goes back for centuries. So I'm reading right now, I'm reading Greg Grandin's new book, America, which is kind of the story of North and South America. And the beginning of the book is all about the Spanish conquest. And my goodness, I mean, I knew about the Spanish conquest, but really diving deep into that history shows you how the story of history, even within the church, has been to theologically justify human atrocities, where you sort of get God on your side, right? And the enslaving of native peoples, but yet there's like Bartolome de las Casas, right, who was sort of a voice that rose up to sort of challenge that establishment and to challenge that way of thinking. And even studying his life, it's like, man, this was really hard for him because he's coming up against the power of empire and so much resistance, but yet his words live on, and he was able to influence in so many different ways. Speak to that in terms of just historical context and the work of justice and why it's important, even when it feels like, 2 steps forward, 400 steps back constantly.
I love what you just shared, David, of how the work of justice is ultimately long obedience in the same direction kind of work, right?
Yeah.
It's not overnight, put it in a microwave and expect instant results kind of a thing. This is like the butter chicken or the chicken biryani that you marinate overnight for many, 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 many nights. It's like fine wine, I guess, right? And you keep just being faithful, right? And so I say this in my book. I have a chapter on advocacy where I say, hey, I've only done advocacy 10 years, but I've gotten to start a lot of campaigns. I've gotten to continue a lot of campaigns, and I've gotten to finish a lot of campaigns successfully. And the reason for that is because others started it. I came, I'm thinking of the Romero prayer here, even as you asked that question. And this is in honor of St. Oscar Romero, Bishop Oscar Romero, who was a martyr of the church in El Salvador, was killed for standing up to a corrupt government empire. And, he says this, or someone who embodied his life in a prayer wrote this and said, we plant the seeds that one day it will grow. We water the seeds already planted, knowing that they will hold future promise. We lay foundations that will need further development. We provide yeast that produces effects far beyond our capabilities. We cannot do everything, and there is a sense of liberation in realizing that. This enables to do something and to do it well. It may be incomplete, but it is a beginning, a step along the way, an opportunity for the Lord's grace to enter and do the rest. We may never see the end results, but that is the difference between the master builder and the worker, And so I think prayers like this ground us and just remind us. And again, these are prayers for justice that have been in the Christian tradition for centuries, right? None of this is new. We have been cut off from the history of this as the church because of, our participation in empires and our access to political powers all over the world, including through colonization, which I unpack in the book. But the Spirit's always at work, and they're always good people everywhere. Like in my experience working with lawyers around the world, even the most corrupt police department will always have one person of peace in it, someone who cares about their community and who has the Spirit of God working in them in some way, seen and unseen. So yeah, that's where I take encouragement.
What's a healthy way for Christians to think about their engagement in politics, right? Because the pushback is, well, what, do we just sort of leave this domain of life sort of untouched by God? Like, do we just sort of retreat? Why wouldn't we just, want to get righteous people in office and to take Christians in charge? And we don't have to dive into Christian nationalism and the dangers of that. I mean, we can. But I want to, what's a healthy way for the people of God to think about politics and being a citizen of the United States.
Yeah, that's so good, David. I think, and this is where my story has shaped my view of this so much, right? Like, I myself was once there. I myself was in the place of, we need Christians in the highest government offices. And that is true. I still hold to that today. I think Christians who are called to government and politics, should be there. But I think the difference ultimately comes down to what we see in Philippians chapter 2, right? We see Jesus giving away power for the flourishing of life on earth. And that's a big part of the gospel and the ultimate objective of the gospel, right? For Jesus to restore all things when he returns to judge the living and the dead, as we see in the creeds. And so I think, I think that's where the line is drawn for me. And, I often have friends on the right, not that I identify with the left, but friends further on the right who come to me and say, hey, isn't what you're pushing for Christian nationalism too? Like when you want Christian ideas of justice to be in the public square, isn't that a form of Christian nationalism? To which I say, actually, no, there's a huge difference. And this is something I've learned from the Global South Church that prioritizes justice, even in contexts where the church is being persecuted. When they have every right to be advocating for themselves, they show up with their government leaders, not on behalf of themselves, but on behalf of those with even less privilege than them, with even less rights than them, like victims of trafficking and violence. And I think that is Christian advocacy. And that's what did it for me, working in Georgia Republican politics, where I thought Christian advocacy was advocating for the 10 Commandments or school prayer. And again, like coming from the best intentions and doing this, but then essentially, going to the Global South Church and having those illusions shattered completely in persecuted church contexts, where they're advocating not on behalf of themselves, but on behalf of those with lesser rights than them. And I think that's the Jesus thing to do, to not be concerned about our own rights, but to say, take my rights if that helps bring healing to this world. And so I think that needs to be the posture of Christian advocacy. One other thing I'll say real quick, David, is in the book, I say, be politically agnostic, except on behalf of our marginalized neighbors and except on behalf of all our marginalized neighbors, right? So this is what happens, unfortunately. I think Christians with the best intentions to love their neighbor get into politics. And I speak from personal experience. And then we kind of get caught up in the power systems and the empire structures of this earth and realize that we can't, be for all marginalized people, or then we're going to lose political power and access, right? And so my invitation to the church is, don't be concerned about the political power access. Just be faithful on behalf of all our marginalized neighbors, everyone in need of justice, and be politically agnostic, apart from that. And that is our client. And I've learned this from Global South Church leaders who've told me, it doesn't matter. Today it doesn't matter who's in power in our country. Today we've got, left-wing communists in our country. Tomorrow it could be the Muslim nationalists or the Hindu nationalists. It doesn't matter. We're going to keep standing with our marginalized neighbors, regardless of who's in power.
That's so good, man. Wow. So much to unpack there. Yeah, when you look at Jesus and his quote unquote strategy, it was never to usurp Caesar's throne or to rise to this position of societal influence. He was always on the margins. He could have at any point seized the throne, seized power, and demanded that people worship him. That was what Satan offered to him is, if you'll just worship me, I'll give you all of this, all the kingdoms, whatever. And so that's why the title of your book, The Justice of Jesus, when you look at Jesus, there's something about us modeling our practice and our lives after what Jesus did, because the intersection of Christianity and power is compromise. I don't think there's any way to not compromise your Christianity when it intersects with power, right?
Totally. I mean, and this is where I've seen really, really good people I can still consider brothers in Christ. I saw them coming up in Georgia Republican politics, young lawmakers, state representatives, state senators got in with the best of intentions to love God and neighbor. And then ultimately realized that, wow, if I want to stay in power, I am going to have to make compromises for the sake, on behalf of my marginalized neighbors,
Yeah.
really. So, I will have to stand against some of my marginalized neighbors, the more power I want. And it's a drug, right? At the end of the day, we weren't made for this. Our souls, our bodies weren't made for empire's power. We were made to share power with Jesus and to give it away to our marginalized neighbors, but not amass power for ourselves. That is not the Jesus way, like you rightly pointed out. So yeah, I've seen people with the best intentions come in, and I mean, I can think of one person today who has honored, the image of God in themselves and their marginalized neighbors, but has paid the political cost for it big time, and and was kicked out of the party and all of that. So there are real consequences. And this was a senior office holder in Georgia politics, and so I think it's difficult for Christians in the political world. I'm not called to do that anymore, and I'm really grateful for it. I'm sure some folks are, but I think the role of the church is to stand in the gap, because we stand in a long line of prophets who stood in the gap between the oppressed and those with power and spoke up on behalf of those whose voices are suppressed.
Come on, man. I can't think of a more relevant challenge to the church today, because, man, so many are sort of caught up in our current political climate and just being swept up into that narrative of this is, we're in this season of revival and God's bringing the church to the forefront again. And it's really, really challenging. So, Joash, my favorite part about your book, I love all of it, but probably what I learned the most from was you talking about colonization. Growing up as a white evangelical in the white evangelical church, I don't think I even ever heard the word colonization, right? It's not something that pastors preach on a typical Sunday morning. But these are your words. You said this: the Western Church's historical support for colonization has shaped us to resist justice. Can you unpack that?
Yeah. And I think this is something I learned working in the justice space internationally with the global church, right? Injustice isn't just bad for the oppressed, it's also bad for the oppressors and those on their side, right? And for anyone who's concerned, I'm using oppressor language. This is from Ecclesiastes, where there are categories of oppressed and oppressor in the Bible. So these aren't academic categories I'm pulling from. These are biblical categories to me as a leader in the church. So there's, and I think I think it's in Ecclesiastes 2, where it says, it's God saying, I looked around the earth, and I looked at the oppressed, and they had no one to stand on their side, and power and wealth was on the side of the oppressor, right? And so again, these are biblical categories that I'm talking about, but I think we don't realize that injustice isn't just bad for the humanity of the oppressed; it's also bad for the humanity of the oppressor, because God didn't design human beings to be oppressing others and to be bullying others and to be stealing their resources, right? That is not God's will for their lives either. And so I think, the really the big thesis of the book is that colonization wasn't just bad for my ancestors in the global South. It wasn't just bad for global South Christians. It's also bad for the Western church. It was bad for the Western church because it shaped us to resist justice for our marginalized neighbors here through our participation in the colonial project, right? So when I say colonization, I'm not talking about an academic theory. I'm talking about lived experience of global South Christians, including my family that was Christian for 1,500 years before the Portuguese colonizers showed up. And, I think it's important for us to wrestle with how the world we live in, including the way we see Jesus and neighbor, has been shaped by colonialism. So one example that I provide in the book is this belief and praxis of Jesus cares way more about the salvation of my soul than the freedom and well-being of my human body, right? And that is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. The gospel of Jesus was both physical and spiritual. You see that throughout the way Jesus lives his life. Luke chapter 4, verse 18, Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, to set the oppressed free."
Yeah.
And then he goes on to do those things by healing sick people, feeding hungry people, right? We see him do these things throughout the rest of the gospel. But it's tragic because I feel like in the Western church, because of our participation in colonialism, we've been shaped to reduce the gospel to just something that is spiritual while ignoring the physical good news to the poor part of it. And I've seen the gospel be physical good news to the poor and the oppressed, to children in trafficking, and it's shaped me. And I think we need to recover that holistic definition of the gospel. So I'm not calling us to change it. I'm calling us to widen our understanding of it that's been robbed by colonialism. Because, when the church participated in colonization or slavery, which was a result of colonization, we said things to the enslaved and colonized people like, Jesus cares more about the salvation of your soul than the freedom of your human body and the well-being of your human body. So don't worry about the chains and the shackles.
All will be made
right?
right one day.
Exactly. Right. just die, go up to heaven, and everything's fine, right? And that's not the historical understanding of the gospel or of Christianity. And so that's what I call us back to as the church. Yeah.
Yeah, you said in your book, Joash, the work of decolonization will always be a threat to the beneficiaries of colonization, especially those who have not wrestled much with how they have benefited from colonization. So unpack this. I just think this is like a way of thinking that a lot of the American church, the Western church, are just not thinking along these terms, right? Because for generations we have been the beneficiaries of injustice. And I want you just to help us see what are some specific ways we are ignorant today and we sort of take this for granted.
Yeah. And again, I'll share this from my own experience, right? I say throughout the book that I am both a survivor of colonization, having grown up in the Global South Church, and I'm a beneficiary of colonization at the same time. As an immigrant who even lives in the West today, who lives on land in North America that was settled through illicit means, stolen even from our indigenous neighbors, lives with resources here that were stolen from our indigenous neighbor as well as around the world. And so, there aren't no clear categories of oppressed and oppressor. I think the lines are always moving. And I recognize my own privilege as someone who's also benefited from colonization. And so, I think it's important for us to look at history and reckon with how we can be both the oppressed and the oppressor at the same time. And I think every human being has it within them to be both at the same time. But at the same time, one idea that I call us to is God's preferential option towards people who are oppressed. And I say that if you get nothing else from reading the book, I hope that you get this, is that God always stands with people who are poor and oppressed, regardless of which side they're on. And if the categories ever switch sides, then God also then switches sides to stand with the newly oppressed people. And that happens throughout human history. And so for us as the church, we need to pray to have the eyes to see who is being oppressed at any given point in time, because those categories could be changing, and move with the Spirit in that direction. So I think, again, colonialism, when I speak of it, it's not an academic theory. It's not a political talking point even. It's lived experience. And for me, colonialism, decolonizing faith isn't the end goal. It's a means to an end of loving God and neighbor better.
Yeah. Well, a big part of it, Joash, that you uncover in your book is so much of our theology in the West has been shaped by white men, and you say the term, every every pocket of the global church has blind spots, right?
Yeah.
And so there's something dangerous about just learning theology from only one segment of the global church, right? And I saw this in my own life growing up. I had never been exposed to any global South theologians or authors or black theologians writing from the perspective of black liberation in America. And there's something about whenever you hear from those different voices, it gives you a humility and begins to sort of shape your theology probably in a more holistic way. Can you kind of talk about that? I know this is probably controversial,
Yeah.
right? Because in America, we hold certain theologians as sort of almost gospel truth because of, who they are, what they've written. But talk about the value of opening ourselves up to other voices and maybe make some recommendations who are some
Yeah.
other authors or theologians that we should be paying attention to.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I appreciate the question so much, and I would say that of any majority culture with power, right? Not just my white brothers, sisters, siblings. I would say learning about Jesus through the eyes of those with power is dangerous for us. And if we're only learning about Jesus through their eyes,
It's
it's
good.
dangerous for us because ultimately God is a God of the oppressed. Jesus stands with those on the margins. He's present in the margins. And we need to cultivate the eyes to see Jesus better among the powerless because that's where God is, right? And so I think people without power on the margins of society can teach us so much about Jesus, even if they don't worship him by that name. They can teach us so much about Jesus if we have the curiosity and the humility to engage and learn.
Yes.
And we cultivate the eyes to see Jesus at work there because Jesus is everywhere. Right? He's not just in the church. He's all over the world. He's not
Yep.
just in the Bible. He's everywhere. And so if we have the eyes to see him. So I think, for me, what was an eye-opening moment, and you asked about this earlier, David. Eye-opening moment for me was 2020 when George Floyd was killed, right? And you had this racial reckoning in the US. And I lived in Atlanta, Georgia when all this went down. And I, as a person of color myself, who had experienced racism in the US South too, and really in other parts of the US too, like DC, I started looking for perspectives that would make the gospel good news to the bad news of racism in
Yep.
this world. And I found out that all my favorite white American theologians at that time disappointed me because they had nothing to offer to them.
Total
And again,
silence. Yeah.
right, total silence. And again, like, I don't blame them for it. That's not their lived experience. So
Yeah.
in many ways, I was expecting things of them that aren't their experience unless they go and learn from marginalized neighbors themselves. But to me, and I say this throughout the book, it taught me that, there's nothing wrong with learning theology and learning about Jesus from people with power and white American men. But the global church is made up of people who aren't just white American men, right? In fact, Americans would be a minority in the global church of any race, really, right?
Yep.
And because the global church is so vast and humongous and exploding in the global south. So what can we learn from people on the margins? So for me, the gospel started to sound like good news again. It just started to hit different again when I started reading Black liberation theology and people like James Cone. And, he wrote this book. I'm sure you've read it. The Cross and the Lynching Tree is the best piece of systematic theology I've ever read. It makes Jesus good news to people who were lynched in the US South and hung on a tree because Jesus was also hung on a tree, right? And
Yeah.
so he makes those connections and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm seeing Jesus in a new light again. I'm learning the gospel all over again through the eyes of other Christians with different life experiences and histories and traumas. And so, it's not just the Black church. I've learned from the Latin American church, both evangelical and Catholic. So in evangelical, you people in the Lausanne movement, like Rene Padilla. In the Catholic Church, you've had fathers like Gustavo Gutierrez, the Boffs, right, who've written about liberation theology. But also lately for me, it's been our Palestinian brothers and sisters and siblings, right? And people like Munter Ashak and Rafiq Khoury and, others who write from the perspectives of really the first Christians, because if I trace my ancestry to St. Thomas Christians as an indigenous pre-colonial Christian tradition, we got the gospel from the church in Palestine, modern day Palestine, right? Because that's where Jesus was,
Right.
the Israel Judeo-Palestinian region. And so their perspectives have been so formative for me now because they're still suffering. The Palestinian church is one of the most persecuted churches right now from every side, right? And again, how is Jesus good news to children under the rubble right now, right? And children being bombed to death right now. And the Palestinian church teaches us about that, and they show us the hope in the midst of being bombed. And so I think it's and not just from men, but also from women, right? Like I tell people, hey, like read feminist theologians. Now, you don't have to agree with everything they say. You don't have to agree with everything I say, but hear them out because they're siblings in Christ too. And they have the image of God in them too. And they have unique perspectives on Jesus that might just bless us, even if we don't agree with everything. And then again, to your point, we have been shaped by people who participated in slavery and colonization in the Western church. They're the people who taught us about Jesus, right? And so there's some baggage that we've inherited there. And one example of this would be someone I get into trouble a lot for mentioning as someone maybe we shouldn't learn as much theology from or center as much would be Jonathan Edwards, right? He's like America's top theologian, really, but the dude owned people in slavery. So sometimes I poke holes and ask questions like, how good could his understanding of the Trinity really have been if he was okay with owning people in slavery, right? Now, of course, like we can still learn things from Jonathan Edwards because the image of God is in him too. But I think people like that have taught us about Jesus. So we're okay with injustice in this world. We're okay with people suffering physically as long as they're saved spiritually. And I don't think that's the gospel of Jesus that we see in the Bible.
Amen. What you're describing, Joash, is to remain curious.
Yeah.
Right? To move through life with a humility and a grace and a curiosity to say the work of Jesus is not just in my white American bubble, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you have the curiosity to see and to explore and to look, you will see the image of God and the beauty of God in so many different spaces. And I can attest to that. Having not, for most of my life, having not exposed myself to other voices and theologians and perspectives, having done that in the last couple of years, it's been so enriching for me, not only theologically, but I think it produces a sympathy in some ways or a humility towards other people that whenever you're just sort of ingrained in one way of thinking, you can sort of have these hard edges and your faith becomes more combative. Like, let me just defend rather than love, which I think a lot of Christians in America are all about defending their faith rather than loving and learning from each other,
Right. And I say this in the book as well. I say that truth that requires violence in word or in deed is no truth at all. Truth that requires to be defended is no truth at all, because truth just is. It is truth. And if Jesus could stand before Pilate and Pilate tell Jesus what is truth and Jesus not feel the need to defend himself, then maybe we can learn from that too. And so you're right, though. I think there are historical connections to even this defensiveness. And it's in tracing it back to, I think Willie James Jennings does this so well, where he says, where did we get our faith from in the West, in North America, right? Well, we got it from people who came with a posture of militant defensiveness, people who were shaped by their own traumas in Europe and were coming here
right.
to colonize and to enslave and to, steal wealth, resources, land, and and this posture of militant defensiveness. And so I think that posture still continues today, and that has nothing to do with Jesus. That's just some baggage we picked up along the way in history. And and again, I say this throughout the book, like, if the gospel isn't good news to our poor and oppressed neighbors, then it's not the gospel of Jesus Christ by Jesus's own definition.
Yeah.
And if folks have a problem with that, the problem isn't with us saying that. The problem is with Jesus, who embodied a very different gospel.
Yeah. I know this is like a futile thought experiment, but it's almost like, man, if we could go back in time to when the doctrine of discovery was sort of written into church code, it's like, if I go back right there and say, wait a second, let's pause right here. Like, the sort of harm we could have mitigated by not allowing that to happen, to take something as, as long as you find it, you can claim it as your own, that sort of thinking. And the ripple effects that has had throughout history is mind-blowing when you think about it.
Totally, David. And I'd go even further back to Constantine, right? Like, because for the first 300 years of the church was on the margins. They were threats to empire.
Yep.
Like Jesus, Paul, Peter were literally crucified and killed by empire. And then we started having access to political power. The emperor becomes Christian. So now everyone says they're Christian to enjoy privileged status in the empire, even if their lives look nothing like Jesus and more like the emperor. It would never happen today, by the way. So, I think, right, history never repeats itself.
Never.
But there's so many lessons from church history that we can learn. And I preached in the Nicene Creed this past Sunday at the church I serve in the teaching team for in Canada. But there's also this, the debates around original sin is something I'd go back to. There's so much good in Augustine's theology. I quote his definition for justice in my book. But I think we're also shaped by this posture of the world is evil, a very Gnostic posture of the world is evil. There's no inherent goodness in it. When, we're shaped by Genesis 3, when we forget that Genesis 1 comes before Genesis 3, and we see that God created everything and he said, it is good, right? And we forget the inherent goodness in us, in our neighbor, and creation.
You're really offending the Reformed folks right now.
In case you weren't sure about,
Stay curious.
And again, like, I would say, again, like, this is, newer to me too, because I went to Dallas Theological Seminary. I have 2 master's degrees from there. So I used to be very reformed in my theology as well, and still appreciate so much of it. But at the same time, I've come to, it's like, once you see empire throughout human history and how the church has interacted with it, you can't unsee it, right? It's everywhere. You can't unsee it. And it shapes you to look at things differently. So I've been studying, the Celtic Christians lately. And this is an ancient, indigenous, pre-colonial Christian tradition in the West, not even the Eastern Church, in the West. Mm-hmm. And they had unique ways of understanding Creator God, right? One of the things that they would say that they got in trouble for is, when you look at the face of a newborn baby, you're looking at the face of God, because the image of God is present in that child, right? And so much of that has been misrepresented today by empire and empire narratives to say things like, oh, you're saying you don't need Jesus. No, that's not what Celtic Christians said. They worship Jesus because they realized that image of God can get diluted by sin in the world. So you need Jesus. The light within us can get dimmed by the sin in the world. So you need Jesus to point us. But it's a theology for this lifetime and not just the afterlife, right? And so many of them were branded as heretics by empire. And, people like Augustine were preferred because they were more privileged with empire. They were saying things that would help the empire keep the church in line. And so I think it's important for us to wrestle with this, even if we don't agree with the Celtic Christians. It's important to still know that empires have shaped our theology even before colonization came around.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking with a friend the other day, and I was like, you know what, I think it would be so healthy for many white evangelical Christians to attend a black church for a year and to sit under a black pastor. Not a black staff pastor in a white church, but a black church, right? Because you pick up on some new thinking and a new aspect of liberation and justice that you just don't hear in the white church because you haven't had to be a survivor to the same degree that many in the black church have for a long time. And so sitting under that, I think, would be so, not that it would probably happen for many people, but I think that would just be so enriching and helpful to our political climate and our theology. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Brother, I would say that even to Indian uncles and aunties in the church who haven't reckoned with our own privilege and coming here as privileged, high-skilled immigrants who were, got the best education and came here at the best opportunities. And then I know this myself. Like I've heard Indian uncles and aunties in the church say things like, well, look at our black neighbors. What's wrong with them? Look at us. We just came here 5 years ago and we're so successful. Look at them. They've been here so long and why can't they get it together? And that's failing to recognize the history and the trauma that's shaped these communities, right? So sit with that, be humble, as Kendrick Lamar says, sit down, be humble, go and learn from these marginalized neighbors and sit under their leadership. And David, I actually did that for most of 2021, right before I moved to Canada, because I was so disillusioned with the majority culture evangelical church in the States. And I was in seminary at DTS at the same time and didn't know how to reconstruct my faith. And so I started reading James Cone, Black Liberation Theology. I started watching preachers like Charlie Dates, started attending Black church services, did that for most of 2021. And that honestly saved my faith. And then the Canadian evangelical church saved my faith even more. So yeah, really grateful for the witness of Christians in the margins.
What are the differences that you can see between the Canadian evangelical church and the American evangelical church?
Yeah. I actually got to present a paper on this at the Evangelical Theological Society last year. And I think one of the biggest differences for me is that, well, two things I'd say. One is the evangelical church in Canada is so stinking diverse. Like, it is so multi-ethnic. And immigrants are actually, and this is true for the States too, by the way, immigrants are from the global South are actually strengthening the church in North America right now. And this is why I feel like the immigration policies of the day are going to have an impact on the church, mark my words, in North America. Because you talk to most church leaders, especially in Canada, they'll tell you that immigrants are strengthening the Canadian church. So whether that's the Orthodox Church, the Evangelical Church, Baptist churches, like Catholic Church, and I've even looked at data because I work in fundraising in the Christian ministry world in Canada. And I've seen data that, the foreign-born Canadians are twice as more likely to give to good causes than Canadian-born Canadians, right? And so there's generosity in these communities too, because you're taught to give generously, or you're taught to tithe. I talk about this also in the book, like watching tithing baskets pass by me was a brand new experience coming to the Western church, because growing up in India, my parents would always give me cash in my hand to give on top of regular tithing to the church, right? And so anyway, so I think immigrants are really strengthening the North American church. The only two denominations, the only denomination in the evangelical world in North America that's growing right now, both in the US and Canada, is the Assemblies of God denomination. And it's purely because of immigration. It's not that they're doing anything unique, I think. I think it's because you're seeing Pentecostals come from the global South look for Pentecostal churches that are majority culture in North America. And that's why I think it's growing. So anyway, I think that's one key difference. The other thing that I've noticed is Canadian evangelicals and the Canadian church don't have any political power, really. We're on the margins. So even in doing advocacy in the US and then come to Canada and working in advocacy and seeing, hey, the US church has, political influence. So we can find pastors and get them to advocate for international development funds, for example, and have success. In Canada, you can't do that at all because the church really is on the margins of Canadian society. And I actually enjoy this because it reminds me of the freshness of the Indian church a good bit. When you're on the margins, when you're not distracted by political power, you're just freed up to love God and love neighbor and be faithful and not be caught up trying to amass power for yourselves. And I think that's another key difference between the churches across the borders. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, on that topic of immigration, I mean, that is fascinating to hear about the Assemblies of God Church and the growth there. But yeah, the narrative around immigration today, it's crazy. Whenever you're unwilling to see your own sin when you're in power, you have to find some sort of scapegoat to blame the issues of society on. And too often that gets tossed to those on the margins rather than those in power looking inside and saying,
Absolutely.
I might have something to do with this, and that is a tragedy. And that is all the more why the church needs to stand with those who are marginalized, to lift them up, to stand with them, because that's what Jesus would do.
Amen. And, just to provide one real example of that, even in Canada right now, I think this is true for the States too. You have this myth that's been developed, and I've seen US church leaders actually say this too, this myth that has been developed that immigration is the real reason for the housing crisis in both the US and Canada right now. And it's total bogus because, again, you're pitting one marginalized people group against the other. And this is what empires ultimately do, try to divide and conquer, right? It's the oldest way of the colonizers, when in reality, the gospel of Christ unites to heal. And I think we as the church get divided on these political lines. We try to scapegoat marginalized neighbors too, without asking questions like, wait a second, what about the people who own property and are gentrifying neighborhoods and are hiking up rent? And, what about the greed aspect to this? Why do we not ask questions about that?
Yep.
And instead find it easier to scapegoat immigrants or homeless people?
Yeah. Joash, is there a middle ground? I'm just thinking out loud here.
Yeah.
In talking about empire, right? So often is the evil empire, right? That's the story of Star Wars and the Emperor and Darth Vader, and then you have the Resistance and even the new. I don't know if you're a Star Wars fan, but the new
Big time.
Andor is all about this resisting empire. Is it appropriate to always think of political leaders and presidents and those in power as the evil empire? Or is there a more balanced way to think about it? Because I don't always think it's evil at work, but maybe I'm missing something.
No, I think I'm with you. I think people are people at the end of the day. There's goodness in them. They're made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they're good people who are just operating under systems of empire.
And let's be clear. Some of them are not good people. Those people do exist as well.
You said it, not me.
I said it. But yes, there are some good people that are stuck in a broken system.
Yeah, they're stuck in a broken system. And it's not just government, man. Like, I've seen this in the Christian ministry world. I see people who care so deeply about justice, and the moment there's, a threat to losing power, or losing donors, or, losing influence with governments, we do weird things. We betray our values. We start operating within these systems of empires. And this is also true for the church and ministry world with all the unhealth we have here. So it's not just true for politicians. So I would say, people are just people at the end of the day, and it's these systems and structures that need to be dismantled and reimagined to look more like the systems that Jesus will usher in when he returns to make everything right on
Yeah.
earth, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's the perspective I have. Now, something else I'll also say is I often get asked, Joash, is there any good that you see to colonization, or would you say it was all bad, right? And I say, well, you know, I I won't give credit to people who engaged in colonization. I'll give credit to God for the good things that come from it.
Yeah.
So, I have Indian Christians who often ask me, hey, I love your family heritage, but my ancestors were Hindu, and it's the Western missionaries who introduced me to Jesus. And yes, they came through colonialism. Yes, they, may have participated in some bad stuff, but what about that? And to which I say, well, I, I think you're giving Western powers too much credit. You know, it's God who saved you. It's the Spirit of God who awakened something in your ancestors when they heard the name Jesus, right? And so you're giving the credit that's due to God to these empires. So I think something that I wrestle with so much, and I say a lot in conversations these days, is that God's way of operating is bringing great beauty out of the mess of humanity. What the enemy intended for evil, God works out for good. And this is a glory to God moment and not a glory to empire moment, right? So it's important for us to see God at work through the brokenness of humanity, through broken situations, even through persecution. These aren't good things, right? When persecution happens in the early church, or even today, and the church is dispersed and more churches are planted, we don't say praise God for persecution, praise God for the hand of the empire that persecuted us. We say that was never good. No one should go through that. And at the same time, praise God for his goodness to work through the brokenness of humanity. I think that's the same posture we should have for colonization and empire.
Yeah, that's helpful. Joash, let's close with this. How can churches today prioritize justice?
Yeah. So I wrote 3 whole chapters on this in the book with very, very practical tips for what you can do based on what I've seen churches do, even in the West, to prioritize justice. So there's a lot to be discouraged by, but there's also a lot of signs of hope. And even today, I did a social media post on, there's been a lot of bad news. Where's the good news? Well, here are some churches that you've never heard of in Canada who are getting justice right? And this is true for churches in the States and around the world. And so I try to capture those learnings in those 3 chapters. So the 3 things I say that are probably the best things we can do as the church to seek the justice of Jesus would be pray, give, and advocate, right? Or pray, partner, advocate. And the nuances to this and what that looks like, and I go into great detail in the book. But, with prayer, I say, I reframe prayer for us, where I think for so much of our history all across the world, we look at prayer as a vending machine, and there's a place for intercessory prayer, but the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray, the Lord's Prayer, is actually a prayer of spiritual formation to seek justice, right? And so our prayers should shape us to become more like Jesus. And what if we thought of prayer in that way and prayed with our marginalized neighbors, prayed with our elected officials, not for the victory of our elected officials, but for wisdom for them to govern well and protect our marginalized neighbors. And I say this for partnerships, here's what to look for and who you partner with. And here's our posture as people with power who come into these partnerships with our resources. So I talk about doing vision trips instead of mission trips. And, I'm sure you know this from the Christian nonprofit sector, but many Christian nonprofit organizations are already doing this, where instead of taking churches and church groups from the West to do things in the global South, we're taking people to just be shaped
To
and
learn
be
things.
formed, to learn things exactly
Yes.
from the global church there. And so that's something I also recommend. And then advocate, right? Again, be politically agnostic, but build relationships with your local leaders in government. Get to know them at a human level, because they're image bearers of God too. They're not, yes, they're agents of empire, but they're human beings who are made in the image of God and engage healthily on all these fronts. So Yeah, so the book is full of practical tips to inspire reimagination.
Yeah. Joash, thank you for your time today. Thank you for this book. Just want to encourage our listeners to pick this up, The Justice of Jesus. If you can, take off your woke Marxist bias that you might have and be open to the justice of Jesus. This is a very biblical concept. This is something Jesus embodied. And anyway, it's a great read. I think this would be great for small groups, for churches to go through. If anything, so much of our faith in America is very individualistic. It's my relationship with Jesus, my own personal spiritual disciplines. Rarely is there sort of this concern for justice and for those that look different than I do or have a different socioeconomic status than I do. And I find that is the imbalance. We need that. We need to hear that in our churches today. And I'm grateful for this book. So thank you, Joash. Appreciate you, man.
Thanks, David. This is great. Appreciate you.